Welcome back. I'm Peter St. Onge. This is a weekly roundup of my daily videos on the economy and freedom, where I cut through the BS and lay out what the gaslighting clowns pulled out of their hats this week and what is coming next. Black Friday is upon us, and it turns out Americans are splurging on food and toilet paper. It's that time of year when our leftover legacy media lectures Americans on the evils of rampant consumerism and feeding your children 3 times a day. But a new study covered by Natalie of Chess Chick finds the top items Americans are buying on Black Friday are not the widescreen televisions of Best Buy Gladiator fame, but basic essentials. So 33% of Americans plan to buy household supplies like cleaning products and toiletries to treat themselves for Black Friday. Another 22% are splurging on paper towels and laundry detergent. 25% are buying groceries, 18% are buying home repair materials, and 21% are replacing a worn-out fridge or washer. Why the back to basics? Because the price of all these things soared under Biden. While household budgets are squeezed not only by salaries failing to keep up with prices, but with soaring housing costs that have doubled the price of buying a house between jumping house prices, a doubling in mortgage rates, and additional jumps in insurance and, of course, property tax. My colleague E.J. Antoni estimated these combined for a $7,000 hit to the purchasing power for the typical American family. One study by Realtor.com found the average American now spends a quarter of their monthly take-home on housing. 1 in 10 spend half what they make. As always, this is hardest on the young. A recent study by Card Rates found over half of millennials and Gen Z spend the majority of their income on housing. 1 in 3 have moved back in with their parents. So at their age, their grandparents owned a house, their parents were renting, they are living in mom's basement. It gets worse because it turns out Black Friday shoppers are not just buying groceries, they are financing them, including an explosion in buy now, pay later that, like heroin, dulls the pain today but saves up a world of trouble down the road. So a study last month by Deloitte found that over half of Americans will be financing their Black Friday shopping, rising to 60% for Gen Z, 72% for millennials. In previous videos, I've talked about soaring credit card debt, which just hit $1.2 trillion with 43% of all cards carrying a balance, making monthly payments at interest rates that average 24.5%, which is cheaper than the mafia. Even worse is a surge in so-called buy now, pay later, where you break the payment into little bits every 2 weeks at interest rates that can start small and then balloon up to 37% if you ever miss a payment. So buy now, pay later has exploded since the pandemic, jumping 2.5 times and now accounting for 5% of consumer spending and rising fast. So what's next? American consumers are in dire straits after 4 years of Joe Biden, but there is light at the end of the tunnel. The question now is, how deep is the hole, and can Trump pass enough reforms to get the economy growing fast enough to keep us out of recession and get household income growing again? That's going to depend how much Trump and Elon's Doge can get done on their own via executive orders, and how much the uniparty rhinos and vindictive Democrats stand in the way. It turns out the 4-year border crisis took a single phone call to fix, suggesting maybe they didn't want to fix it. Last week, Donald Trump fixed the border by announcing tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and also China unless their governments start controlling the border and fentanyl trafficking. Specifically, he threatened 25% blanket tariffs on everything from Mexico and Canada, with an extra special 10% bonus for China. The reaction was immediate. Within 40 minutes of issuing his threat on X, Trump posted that he had had a, quote, great conversation with Mexico's president, where she agreed to stop migrant caravans passing through Mexico and promised to cooperate on controlling drugs at the border. Canada's Justin Trudeau, meanwhile, gave an impromptu street interview appearing, quote, shaken, rambling on about the relationship with America and the challenges we can work on together before flying to Mar-a-Lago to grovel in front of Trump. Meanwhile, the European Union, who wasn't even targeted, issued an urgent statement encouraging member states to ramp up purchases of U.S. goods to avoid angering Mr. Trump. So 4 years of carrots didn't work, 40 minutes of stick did the trick. The context here is the U.S. is much more important to these countries than they are to us. They need us, we do not need them. To put it in numbers, Mexico's exports to the U.S. make up over 1/3 of their economy. but our exports to Mexico are just 1.3% of our GDP. Canada's almost as bad. Exports to the U.S. are over one-fifth of their economy, so one-fifth of jobs, but our exports to Canada are 1.4% of our economy. Even for China, we export just one-fourth what they export to us as a share of the economy. So about 1 million jobs in the U.S. are related to export to China, while 20 million Chinese jobs depend on exports to the U.S. Interestingly enough, this is the case for nearly every country on Earth. We are a much bigger share of their economy than they are of ours. Europe is the closest, and even there, we're twice as important to them as they are to us. For countries like Japan or Korea, the ratio is so far off they should be caving on every last trade issue, even before you consider the only reason they aren't Chinese peons is the U.S. Marines. Now, this all matters because it means the U.S. has enormous leverage over just about every country in the world. We can win every trade war. It's easy to forget since our globalist uniparty hasn't been using that leverage. Instead, they've been crawling around begging, say, Korea to buy American beef. Now, you might say it's rude to bully allies who've been treating us like a doormat for 70 years, but note other countries are very proud of using market access to bully their trade partners. The European Union, for example, literally charges non-members Norway or Switzerland annual fees to export to the EU, totaling over $1 billion. Now, if we did that, we'd be charging the EU something like $30 billion. We'd be charging China closer to $50. Perhaps we should. So what's next? The U.S. has been a doormat so long, other countries feel like they own us. Trump is simply giving them a taste of their own medicine. They'll squeal, but given the lopsided nature of globalism, given how much they depend on our markets, they will back down. It's just a question of how much pain they take and how many factories they lose along the way. A word from our lead sponsor, Unchained.com. The holidays are coming. It's time to think about your annual IRA contributions. And the IRA is an investment vehicle that can save you a lot of taxes. And with Unchained, you can hold real Bitcoin in your IRA, get access to trading, inheritance, and loans. And it's the only company where you hold the keys and can verify that your Bitcoin is not being relent like banks do. We've seen futures-based ETFs underperform holding your own Bitcoin, so why settle for less? Book a friendly consultation at unchained.com/IRA. If you own gold, you're probably very happy with prices hitting all-time highs. But your gold can do more. It can generate passive income for you. With monetary metals, you earn up to 5% interest on your gold and silver paid in more ounces. Accredited investors can earn double-digit returns in their bond offerings. All interest is paid in ounces of gold and silver stored in your account free of charge. If your metal is gathering dust at home or costing storage fees in a vault, it is time to start putting your metal to work with Monetary Metals. Visit monetary-metals.com/Peter today to learn more. Now back to our show. Canada's Justin Trudeau nightmare continues. In case you think Joe Biden is bad, spare a thought for our cousins to the north. Last week, Statistics Canada announced that Canada's per capita GDP has shrunk for the sixth consecutive quarter, despite jumps in government spending that continue the Sovietization of the Canadian economy, courtesy of Canada's most famous cosplayer, Justin Trudeau. Just last month, the Bank of Canada, their Federal Reserve, was predicting 1.5% growth. The number came in at 1%, and thanks to the flood of migrants pouring into Canada, it dropped to minus 0.4% per person. This is a problem because Statistics Canada also announced that inflation is jumping again up an annualized 4.8% last month. So that means they can't cut rates to boost the economy since inflation would go up. They are painted in a corner. Now, it's hard to overstate just how bad the past decade under Trudeau has been for Canada. In previous videos, I mentioned how Canada now has West Virginia salaries and San Francisco house prices. To buy a house right now, the average Canadian mortgage would cost 48% of family income. In Vancouver or Toronto, it's closer to 70%. A recent Ipsos poll found 7 in 10 Canadians agree that, quote, Canada is broken. An Angus poll found 42% of Canadians are considering moving to another country. In fact, Canada's had the worst growth out of 50 developed economies since 2019, with wages flat since 2016, so that's 8 lost years. Business investment tanked from 79 cents per dollar of salary to just 55 as $285 billion of investment capital fled. That's about $3 trillion in U.S. terms. Thing is, this all happened very fast. So as recently as 2011, Canada's GDP per capita was higher than the U.S., 52,000 versus 50. 13 years later, Canadians are one-third poorer than Americans. Now, part of it was we only had 4 years of Joe Biden, but they had 9 of Justin Trudeau. But Justin's lurch to government dominance has been much bigger than the U.S. So I mentioned in a recent video how 4 million Canadians work for government. That's about 35 million in U.S. terms. Throw in Canadians who live on welfare, and you've got nearly 40% of the population drawing their paycheck from big government, which makes it hard to win an election. Under Trudeau, government grew 4 times faster than the private sector, government debt jumped by 50% in 4 years, and household debt in Canada is now the highest in the G7, so that's over 100% of income, which is 30 points higher than the U.S. So what's next? The long nightmare could soon be over with a general election scheduled for probably October of next year in Canada. Conservative Pierre Poilievre, famous for wrecking a regime journalist while eating an apple, is currently running 90% in betting markets. Poilievre has been called Canada's Trump, and he's running on cutting government spending, ending Canada's migrant invasion, protecting free speech, promoting housing construction and energy production, and actually jailing criminals, along with auditing Canada's central bank, which would make Ron Paul proud. Now, Canada, along with Europe, will be a test whether the populist surge is a worldwide affair. I suspect it is, for the simple reason our current socialist elites are as incompetent as they are corrupt pretty much everywhere. But like the U.S., the question is how much damage has already been done, how long will it take to fix, and how hard will the entrenched government elite fight back? The Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, aims to gut not only the corrupt federal bureaucracy, but its army of so-called non-government organizations, NGOs, which our administrative state pays for everything from riots and censorship to gender mutilation and industrial-scale human trafficking. Last week on X, Vivek Ramaswamy called for greater scrutiny of government funding of so-called non-government organizations, which are, of course, an oxymoron. If it's government-funded, it's not a non-government organization, and are a way to conceal unconstitutional or even illegal things our government does. Vivek posted, in response to news, that the architect of our Ukraine proxy war, Victoria Nuland, will be joining the National Endowment for Democracy, an NGO whose main activity seems to be organizing coups in places like Ukraine, Georgia, and Syria. Meanwhile, in a widely circulated interview with Joe Rogan, internet pioneer Mark Andreessen detailed how NGOs were central to government moves to censor and even debank dissident voices and companies. Essentially, the NGOs are the cat's paw, the glove on the fist, taking government money to do things that would be patently illegal if the federal government did it themselves. Now, I mentioned in previous videos the striking fact that Democrats seem able to instantly summon hundreds of protesters or rioters. Conservatives' usual joke is that our people have jobs, but when it's organized by a government-funded NGO, protesting and rioting is their job. The NGOs become a standing army on call whenever you need anything from get out the vote to blocking highways to a fiery but peaceful mob. For example, Stanford's so-called Internet Observatory received federal grants to target conservatives as misinformation. It passed that on to social media companies to silence them and to banks to cancel them, making it impossible for regime skeptics to pay their mortgage or feed their kids. Take down one and you scare the other 100. Now, if the government censors you and cancels your bank account for disfavored speech, that is highly illegal. But if they fund the NGO, who then shares the results with Facebook and Chase Bank, hey, we didn't blacklist you. So just how big is this army? There are 1.5 million NGOs in the U.S. employing nearly 13 million people. They collectively rake in $2.7 trillion, making NGOs the same size as manufacturing. To give a flavor, top recipients include the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the World Wildlife Fund, and Catholic Charities USA, which rakes in $1.5 billion of taxpayer money to import illegal aliens. Now that 2.7, a conservative estimate puts up to $500 billion paid directly by government. your tax dollars. So that's $300 from the feds, $200 state and local. Yes, you pay for the illegals and drag queen story time. The National Council of Nonprofits estimates government funding is much higher at nearly 32% of NGO revenue, which is $900 billion. So that would translate into between 2 and 4 million paid activists using your tax dollars to push left-wing causes and do the dirty work the deep state isn't allowed to do on its own. So what's next? The NGO industrial complex serves as both intellectual bodyguard and mob enforcer of the authoritarian deep state. Thanks to Doge, Americans are about to discover just how much of the left is not passionate opposition. It is straight pay-to-play thuggery funded by your tax dollars. It's a very big swamp, and you ain't in it. A word from our sponsor. If you run a business and want to get customers excited about your loyalty and rewards program, you can now implement Bitcoin rewards with Oshi Loyalty. You get all the perks of a full-featured loyalty and reward program with real Bitcoin rewards every time your customers shop, refer, and engage. Boost customer retention, loyalty, and lifetime value. And if you're looking for Bitcoin rewards when you shop, check out the dozens of companies in the Oshi marketplace at Oshi, that's OSHI.tech/shop. Start earning Bitcoin today. Now back to our show. An Auburn University study says every single regulator destroys 158 jobs. With 288,000 federal regulators, the shock is why we still have any jobs at all. So a lot of the excitement about the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, focuses on the dollars saved, but more important is all the things the federal government destroys with those dollars. Specifically, the millions of jobs destroyed by the two scariest words in the English language, federal regulators. A few weeks ago, I mentioned how DOGE under Elon and Vivek were taking aim at the regulatory mothership, which strangles the American economy and fuels the totalitarian administrative state, which you may remember from COVID. A mothership that is oddly enough unconstitutional according to a pair of recent Supreme Court decisions, Loper Bright and West Virginia v. EPA. Now, I asserted this could unleash the economy like nothing we've seen in the past century, and the reason is because it's hard to overstate just how destructive regulations are. A 2017 study by the Phoenix Center and Auburn University found that every single full-time regulator destroys 158 jobs, translating GDP adjusted, that comes to $16.5 million of economic output destroyed for every single regulator. This is made of jobs and businesses that were never started, were stunted by strangling regulations, which are incidentally bought by big corporations specifically to strangle small competitors, and mom and pops chased into bankruptcy as collateral damage to new regulations. Say a diner forced to spend $30,000 on a green exhaust fan. So it's not the bureaucrat's $150,000 salary that matters, it's the 158 jobs he took out. Every single year, you keep him around. In fact, you could fire him, keep paying him for life, and still put 100 families in the middle class. Now, as in recent videos, I mentioned research saying $1 in taxes destroys $3 in GDP. A regulator blows that out of the water. Each dollar in regulator salary destroys $112 in output. Given there's roughly 288,000 full-time federal employees involved in regulatory activities, that implies an annual cost of regulation round about $5 trillion, which is about 1/5 of our entire economy. This means DOGE slashing tens of thousands of regulations could spark mourning in America, even if we keep every last one of them on the payroll for life. So what specifically to cut? The worst three regulatory offenders are the EPA, which preys especially on small business, securities regulations like Dodd-Frank and Sarbanes-Oxley, which have all but closed public markets to startups, and shelter banks and insurers from competition, and labor regulations, namely FLRA and LRB, and alphabet soup including Obamacare mandates and occupational licensing. Those lock small businesses and small entrepreneurs out, and they raise the cost of hiring to the point companies downsize or move to China to survive. Of course, these are just the start. The regulatory code has grown like a monster for 100 years in literally every domain you can imagine, from braiding hair to collecting rainwater on your property to giving health advice, which is illegal unless you're a doctor, so stop telling your friends what to eat. And my personal favorite, the regulatory mandate to literally add poison ethanol to any alcohol that is not taxed, including mouthwash, in case you thought the federal government was above poisoning you on purpose. So what's next? The regulation is central to Trumponomics, low inflation, and fast growth, because the best way to do both is reduce the federal burden. The spending, sure, but above all, the forest of regulations strangling our economy. Thanks for tuning in. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and go to peterstandons.com for daily videos and in-depth articles with charts and all the gory details. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.